Hi, I'm Daryl Jones, Director of Research at Hedgeye. Welcome to our update call on COVID-19. We're going to try to do this weekly as we kind of roll through this. My colleague Neil Howe, who's our resident demographer, is on the phone. He's going to be leading the discussion, but please put any questions you have into the queue and we'll try to hit them at the end of the call. Thanks. Hey, Neil.
Hey. Well, this is great. We don't have any legal disclaimers this time around. I was kind of waiting for that. The fast-talking man. This has been an interesting week. Everyone's staying at home. I just saw that on Amazon, all the best-selling books are coloring books for children. That's right, coloring books. Activities for kids. So I think America is getting used to a kind of a new pace of living here. We have a lot to talk about, and obviously we want to get to your questions at the end. We have a slide here just taking you through our overall agenda for this afternoon. First of all, some overall observations, like we did last week. We need to switch that out. We have the wrong deck up. That's last week's deck. So we're going to hold on a second. Let's get this week's deck up. But we will start with overall observations. We're going to go and talk about the global case and death count update, along with China indicators. And I know, Daryl, you've been, updating us on that, almost daily lately. So you can certainly chime in on that.
Yep.
We're also going to go through talk about the true infection fatality rate, or IFR. As those of you, as I explained last week, that is the vital number for looking at both the spread of the infection and its ultimate, death toll. So we're going to look at that, any new evidence. We're going to focus particularly, kind of the climax of this gathering is the new Imperial College model out of London. This is Neil Ferguson et al. I actually talked about that about 3 or 4 weeks ago, their model making, and why it is alarming policymakers. It is quite a disturbing set of conclusions, and we're going to go through them. Then finally, I'm going to sort of, what that means in terms of what I call the great policy dilemma facing national leaders, and that is mitigation versus suppression. Both options are not pleasant, not good, for reasons we're going to get into. And then finally, a little bit on why universal testing may be essential, and also why the United States is really hopelessly behind. We got off to a very bad start, and I think that's one of the biggest obstacles we face. So let me start out. Do we have a deck? If we have a deck, we need to get on to page 4. I don't know, Daryl, maybe you can check to see if we have a deck ready there.
I think they're pulling it up.
They're loading it as we speak. Okay. Just a few points I wanted to make. Some of these seem trivial. Nomenclature. According to the World Health Organization, we're seeing, 2 terms I think people see in the press. COVID-18 as opposed to SARS, coronavirus 2. One refers to the disease, the other refers to the virus, just in case all of you are wondering. So COVID-19 is still the proper way to refer to the disease. The SARS, coronavirus 2, is the way to refer to the virus itself. The other further point I want to make is that I get this. This really started with President Donald Trump in really looking at, I think you all recall in a press conference he talked about, flu kills 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people a year. Why are people so worried about that? I don't think he's doing that anymore, but about 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was doing that a lot at his rallies, and he did that at his press conference. You still hear that, and totally aside from the point about exponential growth, which I think should worry us all, I think there's another impression that needs to be corrected about that. these two numbers are incomparable. They're fundamentally incomparable. It's kind of comparing apples to oranges. And in my table here, I explain the COVID-19 deaths count that we see officially counted in the United States, Italy, Spain, around the world, are identified case to case with a positive pathogen test, okay? So it's a very limited estimate. It's basically looking at those that we can actually attest actually have the disease, and it was their primary or dominant or exclusive cause of their death. The annual flu deaths that Trump is referring to are statistically inferred, and they're not known until 6 months or a year later. People don't die in hospitals with a little tag showing, I died of the flu, okay? You don't look at death records for this. What they do is they go out and they look at the incidence of flu in every different locality, and statistically, you can fairly accurately infer from that how many of the rise in the death rate that you're seeing in that locality is presumably caused by the flu. Now, if you only had 1 or 2 areas, you would never make a statistical estimate. But if you have 50 or 100 different areas, which the CDC in the United States has, you can make a very accurate estimate. But my point is that these may be...
Neil, just sorry to interrupt. We have the slides now. So what slide are you on?
Oh, this is slide 4.
Slide 4, okay.
So you see, here's my second bullet. So you see, but this is a very expansive estimate. So someone might be dying from something completely different reason, but if the flu in some sense pushed him over the edge, right? We count that as a flu death. That actually shows up. I mean, it may be that he has congestive heart failure. It may be something, he may have cancer. He may have something else, but the flu participated in actually causing him to die when the flu was raised in his community. Anyway, I just want to make that point that these are not comparable numbers just in the kinds of numbers we're talking about. Third point, there's a rising research interest in personal preventative measures. Now, for legal reasons and a million others, I do not offer any kind of medical advice, and I would advise everyone to, talk to your doctor before you do anything, right? But there has been a movement which people are discouraging, and I would agree, to discontinue taking ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. These are people with hypertension, because it turns out that the ACE2 is the receptor on the cell wall where the coronavirus actually infects the cells in the lower respiratory area of the lung. And people have thought that, well, these medications may increase the number of ACE2 receptors and the number of ACE2 enzymes on the surface of cells. I think doctors are recommending do not stop taking these medications. In fact, lowering your blood pressure and making sure that you have plenty of ACE2 there and that your immunological system is stimulated and your inflammation system is reasonably suppressed may be critical to recovering from coronavirus. And in addition, there is research evidence out there, and you can just go on the web. I'm in a future episode, I can actually put up links and you can look at it, that vitamin D supplementation helps to protect against risk of viral respiratory illness in general, and specifically against acute respiratory distress syndrome, which of course is the cause of death in many people from the coronavirus in particular. So a lot of people advise that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of downside to vitamin D supplementation. And particularly during the winter, this actually may be one of the reasons why the incidence rate of a lot of viruses and colds and flus go up during the winter is we don't get enough sunshine, right? So I'm just passing that along, and we might have some things additionally to say about it. That leads into my next bullet, which is the link between climate and COVID-19 transmissibility. And I have a few slides to suggest that there is a link. How strong a link, it's unclear. But again, I'm just telling you that there are a number of researchers who think that the link between climate and any virus transmissibility, could be less the survival of the virus and more the stimulation of your own immune system due to sunshine and vitamin D. And finally, we're going to look quickly at the link between bear markets and recessions. I think that's on a lot of people's minds. So I'm going to go quickly through these charts. Now, the next chart, this is a team in China, and they have shown that there is basically a weak but significant regression that they've seen, a kind of a negative correlation between temperature and humidity and where these different cities are in China versus the R, which is, you all know from being on this show, that this is the R naught. This is the kind of the multiplicity of this disease. This is how fast it spreads, how many people each person infects. So you can see that there is a negative correlation. A lot of those cities and towns north in Manchuria, generally the coldest and driest area, seem to have a higher R, and some of the warmer, wetter places in the south seem to be weaker. And if you're interested in how this, in the next chart, you'll see how this plays out globally. You can see this is their imputed values for R, and you can see what it is in March, and you can see how that improves in May. Interestingly, you can also see in places like Australia and South Africa, it actually obviously gets worse in July, that being their winter. So, this may be good news. It doesn't seem to be a strong effect, and we actually don't even know entirely what causes that effect, okay? The next, take a look at this. This is a question that I know in the last week, I think a lot of people are asking, gee, what is the link between bear markets and recessions? I thought I would just quickly throw this up there, a nice historical take. As you can see, well, generally one does lead into another. In fact, all of the serious recessions have been followed by have been preceded, I should say, by serious bear markets, and you can see where that leads in. Some of the exceptions are kind of worth noting. There was the Kennedy slide in 1962. I think you can see that there. And that was a pretty serious recession. I think a pretty serious bear market. It went down 29%. And that did not, in the 1960s is a very strong economic recovery. Demographic growth was high. Productivity growth was high. We also had another bear market in 1966. And those of you who watch my show know I often point that out as the one instance where we had an inversion of the yield curve, but did not have a recession. Growth did slow down in one quarter almost to absolute zero. So it did have an effect on the economy. And the other, I said, false alarm would clearly be the crash of '87. And I think some people here in our audience probably remember that. A very sudden crash and a pretty steady recovery from that. Anyway, so let's go on to my next big topic here, or my first big topic, and that's the true IFR. Oh, no, that isn't my next topic. The next topic is we're going to go through these. Total cases and deaths outside of China. As you can see, as we did before last week, this is still doubling, every 3 or 4 days, right? So this is where we are now. So last week we were way down here, right? So that's the thing about exponential curves. It just keeps kind of folding over as the number increases. So that's the total outside of China. Next chart, we're going to go down through serially through the number of most cases. So as you can see, the most cases by country now being Italy. And as you can see, also, aside from China, the most deaths, okay? Next chart, we'll go down through these quickly. The next is Iran. You can see Iran, the case count is actually flattening out. It's no longer growing very much, but deaths are still growing exponentially. This suggests that they aren't doing enough testing and they don't know where their cases are. That's disturbing. Okay, next slide. Spain, as you can see, this is hitting Spain very suddenly. You can see it's a very steeply exponential curve. I think it's deaths have almost doubled in just over 2 days. And you can see cases are obviously going up as well. Next. Next down is South Korea. Now, South Korea is interesting. Their caseload is high, but their deaths are relatively low. And that's a case we're going to talk about later of a country that's possibly beginning to deal with this effectively. And you can see the cases are flattening out. Next one. France now in cases is the next in line. And as you can see, it's beginning to resemble Spain and Italy. Emmanuel Macron just agreed to shut Paris down, and things are moving there fast. He has this enormous new, unlimited budgetary stimulus plan. Next. And here's where the USA. Again, sad to say, these both look like pretty steep exponential curves. I will say one beginning to be a good sign is a very steep exponential curve in cases. That may look like a bad sign. It's actually a good sign. It means that we're actually beginning, after an extremely slow start, to go out and actually measure cases. And then finally, this is what it looks like in China. I believe that China, for the first time, they claim to have no new domestic cases that actually don't come from people imported from abroad. Again, I think I've talked about this before. I just don't know how to weigh the merits of Chinese data. Go on quickly just to look at the Chinese economy. We look at the next chart. This is passenger traffic. And as you can see, there's beginning to be some recovery. You can see daily passenger, two different measures of passenger traffic in China. This is updated very recently. As you can see, though, they remain quite a bit below what used to be considered 100%. In the case of this chart on the left here, that was up about 120. Okay, next chart. This just comes from the FT, but I thought I would show this out here. Again, showing the same thing, showing a deep decline in February, and they're showing by some measures some actual rebound in March. We'll have to see where that goes. All right, next. Okay, this is where I was going to go here. The true infection rate. I think, after all, looking at all the evidence, I still maintain what I maintained earlier, that it's probably around 0.5% to 1.0%. I start out here by simply explaining the extreme difficulty of measuring the infection, the infection fatality rate. And that is, in a dynamic situation, you have to know how many people, of the people that are dying now, how many people were actually infected 17, 18, 19 days ago, when at that time, and then you have to know, what about people who had variable, intervals between infection and death? How do you count that in constantly fluctuating conditions? You have exponential growth, meanwhile, of the cases going on. I'm going to come back to this at the very end and give you a very simple kind of formula, but again, I want to remind people the infection rate does not equal the case fatality rate, which is cases that come to the attention of medical authorities, and it certainly doesn't equal current total deaths over current total cases. Okay. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Diamond King. The Diamond King was a cruise ship. No, go, just keep on this chart for a second. The Diamond King was a cruise ship that this is the health statistician's dream, a fixed and tested population. No one got anywhere, and you don't have any mobility, and you can just wait and see what turns out. This is probably the best kind of controlled experiment that we have in estimating an IFR. And at a reasonable end size, you had 3,700 people, right? All outcomes known. Well, it turns out that only 750 tested positive. That's kind of interesting in and of itself. It didn't, apparently they succeeded in keeping it from spreading. Another interesting fact is that 410 were asymptomatic, which is both good news and bad news. It's good news they don't get really sick. The bad news is that it just shows you how difficult it is to control this disease, of which 7 died. Well, what is that? That's an IFR of about 1.0%. This population is older, but they were also probably significantly healthier than average. I mean, they were all on a cruise after all. And so I think you can probably assume from this, again, somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5 IFR. We have inference from national case data. And one thing you find is the more you extensively test the population, the more you turn out all of these kind of asymptomatic or low symptomatic cases, and it brings your case fatality rate, so to speak, down to a true IFR rate, right? So that's one thing. More extensive testing brings this rate down. It also rises as you get to, obviously, with an older population, if it starts initially spreading among older people, and obviously if it's a stressed healthcare system, so that you just simply can't treat all the people that are coming in. And this explains, by the way, some of the big disparity between South Korea and Italy, which we'll look at in just a second. And then you have epidemiological modeling. We're going to turn in just a second to the Imperial College COVID-19 response team and their estimate. But in their modeled data, which they're looking from all kinds of data, including Chinese data, they too say a 0.5 to 1.5 infection fatality rate. Okay, the next, I just want to quickly move through this. Is kind of interesting to just show you, because this disease so differentially impacts the elderly. You can see it actually makes a significant difference which society you're talking about. And one of the reasons why we haven't seen much going on in Africa is, first of all, well, it's a hot and humid climate. That might not be good for viruses, or at least these kinds of viruses. But you can also see just the impact of a different kind of population profile. I mean, take a look at Niger. Life expectancy isn't too long. Fertility rate is very high. You can just see what their population pyramid looks like. And this is the estimated IFR of Niger, much smaller than, say, Brazil or China and Australia. And obviously, these are much smaller than Italy and Japan. And you can just see the impact of age. Now, on the next chart, I'm going to just have two charts here to show the interesting comparison of South Korea and Italy. I mean, take a look at this. So this is, I don't know, well, this is the chart that's up here now, so you can see it. Not sure what number it is, but it's up there. But you can see that in Italy, the cases that are identified are much, much older, and in Korea, they're much, much younger. Well, the question is, does that reflect their population profile? Well, actually not that much. I mean, South Korea is a younger population, but not that much younger. It mainly affects much more testing, and it also affects the fact that in South Korea, it started with that religious group in that southern town of Daegu, and which was filled with young people who came together and hugged each other and all that. Go to the next chart. I'll just show you the difference here. If you take a look at South Korea and Italy and just compare cases to population, you can see in South Korea, it more or less fits the overall population profile. You have a lot of people in their 20s, you don't have as many kids, but nonetheless, you can see overall it conforms more. You can see in Italy here, it's hugely biased to older people, and one of the reasons is because they're only testing people generally who are symptomatic. Older people tend to be more symptomatic, particularly seriously symptomatic. And it also may be because the whole thing has been spreading more among older people, at least initially began spreading among old people in Italy. All right. So let's move on to, where are we going next? This is our next point. Yes, this is the stunning Imperial College model. And I will say this is the group, again, I introduced them earlier. This is Neil Ferguson and a huge team in the London Imperial College. They have a whole very sophisticated epidemiological modeling team, and they have been instrumental in previous epidemics around the world. They are relied on by governments around the world. The British government relies on them, and the US, the White House relies on them. And their recent report has, I think, shaken a lot of people. And I'm going to show you a couple slides from that report in 1 second. But let me just go. I'm not going to go through all these but the basic assumptions are listed here. This is kind of in a do-nothing model, so you don't do anything to constrain, no social distancing, no nothing. These are their assumptions, and they do have a bunch of considered interventions. But you see next the basic results. In the do-nothing model, total deaths And this does not include the effects of overwhelmed healthcare systems, which, as we know in Italy, these can actually multiply deaths seriously. But you're talking about 500,000 in the UK. It peaks in early June. It ends in late July. In the US, you're talking about 2.2 million, peaking in late June and ending in mid-August. So, even that blitzkrieg scenario lasts longer than I think what a lot of people were thinking about. What about the effects of interventions? And you can see, you can go into the thing and take a look at it. They have things like isolating cases, home quarantining people who've been in contact, closing colleges and schools, which turned out to actually have a significant effect, social distancing for the old, and kind of universal social distancing, which means that everyone kind of just goes to work and only goes outside when they have to. And one thing you can see here is that anything except universal, pretty serious universal social distancing, which may actually affect many people's ability to work, only does flatten the curve, but still overwhelms the healthcare system with many additional deaths. If you include a pretty rigorous universal social distancing regime, you can flatten the curve asymptotically to zero. That is, you can bring R0 below 1, but then you would need to stay in place indefinitely, because as soon as you relax, all the infections will come back again. Again, that's the question that everyone's beginning to wonder about in China. And I think you can see here on the next chart, you see quite an alarming curve, right? This is deaths per day. We're talking about peaking sometime in early June at 72,000 deaths per day. Again, this is the completely unconstrained scenario. It spreads slower in the United States because we're more geographically spread out, perhaps because we started a little bit later. And you can also see on the right-hand side, again, we're going to come back to this, I think, in a second, but the incidence by age, it's quite stunning. In other words, who requires hospitalization, who requires critical care, and the infection fatality ratio. Again, we're talking about an average of 0.5 to 1, but as you can see, much higher ratios among older age brackets. All right, next chart. This is a stunning one, okay? These lines at the bottom, these horizontal lines, are basically the critical care beds per capita. This is a limit, right? You go over that limit and you start having to do triage, right? And here you can see now the UK, one advantage of the US system, we have more critical care beds per capita. Well, we spend a lot of money on healthcare. We should get something for it. But as you can see, any of these milder limitation or mitigation options still takes us way over critical beds. And now you understand why the medical division of General Electric, of GE, is beginning to ramp up their production of ventilators and ICU equipment. We have hospital ships that are being ready. I mean, we're beginning to get everything ready here, and you can see on the other side where different countries stand with regard to critical beds per capita. United Kingdom being relatively low here. Next chart. And here you can see the age group share of total hospitalizations and the age group share of total deaths. As you can see, this is a scourge of seniors. There's no other way to talk about it. This just comes directly from the Neil Ferguson data. But this is kind of how you can just see, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s just dominate the total number of deaths. All right, next chart. So here is the dilemma, kind of coming to my conclusion here. This is the dilemma facing national policymakers, in my opinion. You can go for mitigation, and that flattens the curve while allowing more infections sooner, and that's the pursuit of what was famously called, and this was Mr. Valence, I believe. That's the UK scientific advisor. I can't remember I think it's Sir Patrick Valence. But he talked about herd immunity and got a lot of flack for that. But in a sense, that is the only time at which an epidemic stops. That is to say, when those who and where enough people are immune that the R naught basically goes below 1 because there's so many people you contact with have already gotten it, right? But anyway, you do that, but the strength is it minimizes the duration of the epidemic, much less economic damage. The weakness is obviously, you can just see from that earlier chart, it overwhelms the healthcare system. We're talking about ICUs, ventilators, ECMOs, so that people can actually, ventilate, oxygenate their blood, personnel, all of that stuff. The UK, the Netherlands, and the Sweden were beginning to opt for this, but now they're backing away, partly because of the data coming out of these models. The other option is go for suppression. Flatten the curve all the way down to, R naught under 1, defer herd immunity, and the strength is, of course, you minimize deaths. You both minimize the number of cases, and you allow the health system to care fully for everyone who's sick. The weaknesses is it maximizes the duration, much more economic damage, and in fact, it sort of defers any solution indefinitely. This would, by the way, would be a great idea if we could bring up effective antivirals or bring up the date of the introduction of effective vaccine. Then that would really make sense. Right now, though, I think best estimates, we're still talking about at least a year away for a vaccine, and who knows about the antivirals. I would say then, finally, this next point is just, are there variants of the above? And it's kind of an interesting idea. I haven't heard anyone talk about it, but what about smart mitigation? I mean, for instance, allow for more infections, but strictly sequester the older, sicker population. I mean, do something that's a lot more severe or a lot more airtight than anything you can now imagine. And just allow it to kind of go through the young, get all those millennials out, just have them all party, have it all spread through young people, minimal actually stress really on the healthcare system. And then once there, you develop a great deal of herd immunity, and then gradually you can introduce older and older age brackets back into the general population. That might actually work if you could actually execute that kind of plan. The other option is a variant of suppression, that is smart suppression. Suppression with minimal hindrance to work activity, but that would require widespread testing, diligent contact tracking, compliance with universal social distancing. It would require a very socially regimented and disciplined way of life for several months in a row, and perhaps sort of indefinitely until we get some of those pharmacological solutions. And as you can see, what are the requirements for that? Well, you need in order to pursue smart suppression, I think you need early containment help, so you're not dealing with so many cases. You need systematic testing, universal testing maybe, and a culture of social discipline. It has been tried in places. The Italian town of Howe, where actually some of the infections first started in Italy, population of 3,300, they've suppressed infections down to 0. They're basically testing everyone every 10 days, and anyone who's positive, they sequester them, they track them all down. This is something that's routinely being done in the East Asian societies, the Confucian societies, that are successfully beginning to implement some of these measures. It's going to be much harder for the West to do it. But even President Trump now has talked about a national lockdown, and this just leads to my next chart here. Take a look at the countries which are succeeding. South Korea, look who's below, in other words, look who's below the line here. South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. And by the way, there's one that they don't include in here, maybe it was politically incorrect to do so, but that's Taiwan. So Taiwan should also be on this chart. These are all people who are effectively, for the reasons I outlined, have been introducing this kind of smart suppression. Can we do it in the West? I don't know. I mean, Confucian societies, they have a lot more social discipline. They don't, I think particularly Japan, people are talking about that. Japan doesn't do a lot of testing, but then again, they don't touch each other very much. I mean, you ever been to Italy? I mean, it's 2 kisses to everyone you meet. Well, that's also a bigger cultural shift there. So, so I think this actually poses these are real cultural obstacles as well as public policy obstacles when they hit these different national differences. And then let me make my last point in my last chart here, and that is how abysmally the United States has given itself a huge upfront handicap. A snapshot of early COVID-19 testing per capita. I mean, I don't know, Iran is not down on the list, but I think the United States has a lot more in common with Iran than it does with South Korea. And by the way, in the right hand, I take you through the formula for likely infections in a community with unrestrained epidemic for each current death. And if you make just reasonable assumptions, as is growth rate, which are probably true in the United States today, for each new death, there will be approximately 3,400 new cases. Now, on May 18th, there were 41 recorded new deaths, but there were only 48 recorded new cases. But actually, if there were 41 new deaths, we should have noticed 14,000 new cases, which means today in the United States, for every one new case positive that we know about, there are 5 new cases we do not know about. And by the way, as I explained earlier, these people are probably largely younger because they tend to be asymptomatic. They're not coming into health authorities, okay? I think this is a problem, and I think it's, if anyone listens to my podcast, they know that I've ranted about this. I mean, the United States spends nearly 1/5 of its GDP on healthcare. We spend 3 times as much in real dollars per capita than any other even high-income country. And yet, we have so much constrained spending on rudimentary public health with emergency preparedness that we just aren't prepared for this. I mean, we're prepared for H1N1. We prepared, I think, reasonably well for SARS. We weren't prepared for this. So with that, Daryl?
Okay. Let's take some questions here. I have a pretty full queue. First one obviously relates back to your last book, but is this the start of the climax of the fourth turning?
You know, it's interesting. In my last podcast, I kind of walked people through this. The first thing to understand, and people have read, I think my books have understood this, a fourth turning is an era, it's not an event. So it's a generation-long era. It's about, 22, 23 years long. We think America's fourth turning began in 2008 with the GFC and the beginning of the Great Recession, and we think it'll last till probably around the year 2030. So we're about the midpoint, maybe a little past the midpoint. The interesting question, those who've read about our discussion of the morphology of a fourth turning, is it starts with a catalyst, and then it kind of leads to a long period of sort of increasing pessimism, growing distrust of public institutions, often polarization. But ultimately, it leads to a moment of what we call regeneracy. When people begin to identify a new core of sort of public optimism or competence, and usually this is under the threat of a crisis, right? A threat of some real danger. And that's, to me, the real question. Will COVID-19 be the excuse, the trigger, the spark, the place where the nation begins to come together in effective response? I mean, you just saw me talk about testing. I mean, we're about as unprepared for this as we were prepared for World War II, or as anyone thought we were prepared for the crisis that was going to confront us in the Civil War, any of our crises in our history. And I think that the public mood is kind of parallels that in a sense, how far we need to come and how rapidly we need to change. And I think as well, this is going to be a time of great generational turnover in public life. But we're gonna have to wait and see.
Okay. Next question here. I know you've done a lot of work on housing, but how do you see this episode impacting housing prices over the short and long term?
Well, I think a lot of that just depends on, recession. I mean, recessions are never great for housing. I think, interestingly, the big negative, one big negative change that we've experienced recently, which has negatively impacted housing, has been this renaissance in extended family living, right? So a lot of young people are still living with their parents, and a lot of parents are taking them in, and people are retrofitting or outfitting their homes with, wonderful new amenities to take care of this new extended family. People are getting along better together, personally, in different age brackets. This is interesting because actually, when you think about COVID-19 and how it spreads, this actually stresses multi-generational living. I've talked to a lot of households about this. I mean, if you're an older person and you're living with their grandkids and they're still going to school, they're still having play dates, right? You're at risk, right? And so suddenly all of this multi-generational living now causes a very unexpected problem, right? And I think that I hesitate to say that this will actually encourage more home building, but it will certainly, I think, to some extent, at least temporarily for the near-term future, encourage sort of subdivisions of households, or a little bit of a kind of prophylaxis, or a way of constructing barriers, so at least for the foreseeable term, different age brackets can live, as we discussed earlier, a little bit apart from each other. But again, I think the big impact on housing is just going to be, is there a recession, and if so, how serious will it be?
What do you think of Bill Ackman's proposal for a worldwide 30-day business stoppage versus dragging it on for 10 to 18 months?
Wow. What do you buy with that? Okay, so I talked about smart suppression. That just strikes me as dumb suppression. I mean, I don't want to criticize his idea, but why bring all business to a stop? What you want to do is to have some business continue, those that you can efficiently and effortlessly do without too much contact or risk of co-infection. I think what I've tried to discuss is here's the problem again. Think of what China did in February, right? You can totally bring the economy to its halt, and then after a period of time, that will stop additional transmission. But then what's your encore? The population's still susceptible. So as soon as you get active again, we tried that, by the way, in 1918 in the Spanish flu. You can see cities like Philadelphia, which had big parades, and the thing just raced through them really quickly. Lots of deaths very suddenly. And then you had cities like Atlanta, which actually did do curfews and quarantines pretty effectively, slowed the infections way down. Then they relaxed them. Guess what happened? You had a double hump. Infection speeded up again. Death speeded up again. That's the real problem. Unless you can vaccinate people, or unless you buy time to can effectually treat people, then you're simply deferring. You're not solving.
Do you believe the governments and/or markets are over or underestimating the impact of the pandemic? In other words, is the panic warranted, or are we actually causing ourselves a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering? You sort of touched on this a little bit, but what's your thought on that?
I think overall they're still underestimating where we're going to go, and I think for the various reasons. You just look through this Imperial College report. You can't look at these projections together with the options for policy responses. It's very hard to come out optimistic about how our economy is going to fare.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see here. How are we trending compared to Italy mathematically on cases and deaths?
We're growing just about as steeply. We're obviously. I have not seen data. Again, this is part of the CDC problem. If you take a look at Singapore's website, if you just want to see how differently countries, now I will say this, by the way, one of the reasons I say, well, Confucian societies and all this, and that's why they dealt with it more effectively. But if you want to see, and I will say, part of the reason is for a lot of these societies, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, is that they were much more impacted by SARS, and they remember that. And so they actually started their emergency preparedness with SARS. We were not as impacted by that. But if you want to see an incredible response, go to the Singapore website or go to the Taiwan website, and they will give you every day the status of patients, how many there are, who tested what. I mean, they'll to how many have recovered.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a national real-time database. And I'm sure that if you dig down, they even have demographic numbers. I have no idea where to find that in the United States.
Yeah, that's the challenge with the United States. I've been tracking this data, for a lot of our subscribers, and the CDC data is basically useless.
I agree.
You sort of have to rely on independent sources who go to state websites, who go to news articles, but really, it's amazing. The data in the U.S. is probably, among all the developed nations, the worst that exists, which is a little scary.
Well, it's an interesting aspect of kind of liberal democracies like the United States, particularly those that have a very federal, decentralized system of government. There are a lot of strengths to that. There's some huge cultural and social and economic strengths to a system like that. But in a crisis like this, you can see all the weaknesses, laid bare.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, a couple more questions here. Let's see. Based on Pence's comments, it appears testing is still being withheld except for those with symptoms. Based on data from other countries, what is the average? Looking at other countries, what do you think about this policy strategy or move?
Which policies? You mean withholding testing unless people? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's terrible. I mean, I can't imagine a more beneficial subsidy than just to make tests almost on demand. Obviously, you no need to give tests to someone who's coming in every day, but I just don't get it. I mean, the more data, the better. If you want to be able to isolate where it is and which communities to know, for instance, if you ever have to quarantine a community, or if you ever have to put someone in a neighborhood or a home in home isolation, and you need to, once you find out about these tests, you need to have tracking teams. I mean, it's amazing now. China has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these teams. They have like 3 or 4 people on each team. Everyone is identified positive. They track with their GPS on their phones exactly where they went, who they met, who they were in contact with. And now they actually have it, and this is another challenge for our system, right? We don't like people invading our privacy.
Yep.
And here you have your social credit system in China, and you can see some of the effectiveness. They can actually, actually tag people as infection risks, so everyone else can stay away from them. Well, this is not something that we easily do in our kind of society, right? But it's something they do there. I do think that this is it's partly just delay on our part and failure on our part, but I also think it does test our whole way of life politically and culturally.
Yep. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there. We're coming in on an hour. Thanks everybody for the great questions. We're going to try to do these calls once a week until this whole thing subsides and give you updated information. We also have a daily note we do that I think you can subscribe to on the website, just basically numbers and facts on what's happening with COVID. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a good day out there. Take care.
Yeah.